muddy, miserable landing camp fortifications hastily built just under a week prior, British and Hessian troops are stuck waiting for new orders. This debacle started by a series of events and mistakes made after General Thomas Sterling was shot off his horse, succumbing to his wounds near instantly. Prussian Colonel Knyphausen assumed command of the entirety of the Crown's forces. The two-headed European Leviathan became a single snake advancing toward the Hobart Gap in one laboring long column. Initially halted nearing Springfield at the bottom of the Chestnut Street rise entering Connecticut farms, Knyphausen was finally able to amass enough troops to dislodge General William Maxwell's defenses in today's Union Township. The Expeditionary force burned Connecticut farms, but were ultimately turned back, then tracked and fired upon, until reaching relative safety within the intended temporary constructed earthworks at Elizabeth Port. Here they stayed awaiting new orders. This is approximately within a day that General Clinton returned by ship from the Southern Theater. He was briefed and immediately displeased that his orders were misinterpreted by the Hessian Colonel Knyphausen. The German colonel and British counterpart Sterling either misinterpreted Clinton's orders or were, as later claimed, pressured by the Loyalist leaders. The Northern British Army began the last invasion about a week before Clinton's return. The date may have been the original schedule. However, Clinton expected them to wait for his return. Then Knyphausen, with poor intelligence, made a mess of the expedition. Regardless, Clinton went right to work assessing the situation. Clinton, after battling in Elizabeth a couple times, became confident in his new intelligence. The general then put in motion what would be the final attempt to pacify New Jersey, break through the gap, and reach Morristown. He wanted to capture the stores, ending the Continentals' ability to fight and win the war as best case. He also knew if he secured the Hobart Gap, it would force Washington into a large field engagement to protect Morristown. This would, in Clinton's keen mind, give the Northern British Army the chance to end the rebellion. Clinton would have been confident that Washington could not defeat him in such a scenario. So here we find ourselves middle of June 1780 in Elizabethtown, New Jersey, and General Clinton enters the story of the last invasion. Today we discuss American General Hand and the Continental assault on British fortifications at Elizabeth Point. Most people in the area are entirely unaware that an entire Continental field army challenged the invaders to open battle in the large open land that once separated lower Midtown Elizabeth and the Elizabeth Port. There is quite a bit of cat and mouse, intelligence plays, and prick wagging to this story. I did a 4-part series on the last invasion years ago. I was happy with the research, however, those videos are hard to watch now. So here is the first remake. Dawn, a whisper of gray, crept over the Arthur Kill. June the 8th, 1780. A night of shadows, a hasty retreat. Knyphausen's ships, ghosts on the tide, pulling back to Statton's hold. A phantom force, or so they told, left on the point, a story bold. Washington heard before the sun, a tale of weakness, battles won. But he, the fox, with eyes so keen, saw through the veil the hidden scene. His army, a patchwork, bold and frail, could not meet the redcoats, sail for sail. But cunning's whisper, a whispered plea. Deceive them, show them strength, you see. Lord Stirling's charge, 1,000 strong, to make the British think they'd wronged. Hand's regiments, marching bold, militia flanking, stories told. But Hamilton, sharp and ever bright, saw through the lie in fading night. A ruse, a trick, a cunning snare. The British army, hiding there. The point assaulted, a picket seized, the truth revealed, a battle teased. Cannon's thunder, a brutal storm, Hand's brave advance quickly torn. The woods gave shelter, on the left, but musket fire, the peace bereft. Seeley's men, a wild fierce fray, friendly fire in disarray. Cease fire, hold your ranks, I say. Seeley's command to save the day. Hand's bold feint, a daring show, convinced the British they'd no place to go. Knyphausen watched with wary eye no open battle, just cannon's cry. Retreat in order, a disciplined sway, back to the town, to fight another day. Again they marched, into the fray volleys of fire, come what may. Hessians joined, the redcoat line, the struggle raged, till fading shine. A draw they called it, on that field, but strategy won, the British sealed. Washington's choice, to hold the town, or gather strength, must hold the crown. Clinton arrived, a later test, to probe the lines, put them to rest. But scouts revealed the Patriot might, and Springfield's battle in fading light. So listen close to history's call, a nation forged standing tall. Deception's dance and courage's art, a revolution's beat within the American heart. Okay, so now we are caught up to what Clinton walked into right off the boat a week later. We even got the campfire version. I promise. I promise that story will resonate as we go through the meat and potatoes of the time, the Continentals, challenged the near entire rank and file of a British expeditionary, force of some 8,000 to open battle in the city of Elizabeth. I exaggerate, but anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000 British and Hessians were held up in soggy trenches and earthworks. We find Clinton's men morale plummeting, with leadership unsure, unable or unwilling to act stuck in such humiliating disposition is when the general returned. Well, today we discuss how it got that bad that fast. Let's talk about General Hand Assaults, the Point.
After Knyphausen was forced to withdraw from Connecticut farms, Greene had sent one of his artillery officers, a New York artillery officer, that is, to Dehart's Point, which is on the opposite side of the Elizabeth River from where the British Expeditionary Force built their camp, and even including in the map says there was a pontoon bridge for getting men back and forth. We know there wasn't because he was right there, because he would have blown them right out of the water. Of course, it was a precarious place to put a artillery unit, so I'm not sure if he was actually manning a gun on a battery placed at Dehart's Point or if he was just there collecting intelligence. Either way, he sent that letter to Washington, and he was there because of Greene, and, the rest is history.
Sir, I have seen the enemy. Though in view I evaluate are above 3,000, there may be, and probably enough are, others out of flight. They have sent over their horse to the other side, except about 50 for supply. Their baggage, it is agreed on all hands, has been also sent across, and they're wounded. It is not ascertained that any of their infantry have passed to the other side. There are 400 or 500 on the opposite point, but it is uncertain whether they are those who went from this side or those who were on Staten Island. I rather suppose the former. Different conjectures may be made. The present movement may be calculated to draw us down and betray us into inaction. They may have drafted from their intention of sailing last night for fear of our falling upon their rear. I believe this is the case, for as they had but few goals, it would certainly be a delicate maneuver to cross in our faces. We are taking measures to watch their motion tonight as closely as possible, and insufficient but very light skirmishing, very few boats, not more than enough to carry their 400 men at a time. It is likely more will come down this evening. I have the honor to be your Excellency's most obedient servant. Alexander Hamilton.
When the rebels challenged the Redcoats to open field, the battle in E-Town, a pivotal moment, came on June 8, 1780, when General Edward Hand led Continental troops against British positions at Elizabethtown Point. Employing the element of surprise and leveraging their intimate knowledge of the terrain, the American forces engaged the 22nd British Regiment. They managed to push the British back momentarily, showcasing the determination and resilience of the Patriots. The early morning, just after midnight of June 8th, 9000, marched his troops back to the defenses at Elizabethtown Point. The first reports reached Washington well before dawn, stating that most of 9000's force had boarded craft back to Staten Island. Those initial reports believed Kyffhausen only left a beachhead of 500 or so fortified at the point. This information prompted Washington to order a show of force. He knew that his army was not strong enough to face the British in the open field, being half constituted with militia. However, using bold tactics would betray the Redcoats into believing Continental troop strength was much greater than shown the day before. The large amassment of NJ militia forces, unexpected by the British on the 7th, would only reinforce his play. He hoped for either an outright surrender by the rear guard or making them believe that a much larger force stood in Elizabeth proper so as to pin them behind their defenses. Washington gave Lord Stirling the overall command of the American Field Army at Elizabethtown. General Greene ultimately was given command in the defense of Elizabethtown. Stirling entrusted the field command to Brigadier General Edward Hand. Washington sent to Elizabeth 3 battalions of regulars, bolstered with an additional 300 men for the assault. Washington also ordered an additional complement of 2 NJ militia regiments to be on each flank to spread the anticipated 500-strong defenders along the fortifications. This total complement on the field numbered between 1,200 and 1,500 soldiers. I would estimate approximately 300 to 500 mixed Continentals and militia in reserve. That number is an educated guess, as we know Greene had at his pleasure artillery units, light cavalry units for recon and Pony Express, as well a guard for his headquarters. General Stirling had his complement of officers, and likely a few light cavalry assigned to him. Stirling was given 900 Continentals for the operation. We know during the early action 300 were held back as Hand's initial exploratory advance. He only marched out 600 in 3 battalions. There also would have been militia funneling into the town during the action of the day to bolster the reserve. The linchpin to my belief is we also know that defensive earthworks were set to defend Elizabeth by the end of the day's action. Thus, a substantial amount of personnel must have been available. Maxwell's brigade would remain to hold the first bridge at Springfield, leaving Washington, with perhaps 500 to 1,000 troops remaining at the Gap on the west side of Springfield. The largely varied guess as to the strength at the Gap is because it is unknown how many regulars remained in reserve for Stirling under Greene for the defense of Elizabethtown proper. The troop placement for actions on the 8th lends to the notion that despite the first reports, Washington believed the force was much greater, and only a small number rode across to Staten Island. A second report given by future U. S. Secretary of the Treasury Major General Alexander Hamilton alerted Washington that the early reports may have been incorrect. Hamilton believed the majority of the Expeditionary Army, along with full artillery, laid in wait behind the earthworks and pickets, citing that the troops spotted on Staten Island were merely a decoy meant to bring the whole of the Patriot Army out onto the expansive fields and salt marshes between the town and the point. Hamilton's intelligence would prove correct, but it was Washington's confidence in Hamilton ultimately that influenced Washington's correct strategy for actions on the 8th. Battle plan. The Continentals choose a 3-pronged assault. The 3 Continental brigades under Brigadier General Hand would commit to a frontal assault. 1 brigade of militia on each flank would assault the sides of the British entrenchment. The left flank under Colonel Seeley of the Morris County Militia would attack from the northern woods, while the right flank from the marshes of the Elizabeth River. The first action in the assault on the point resulted in the capture of a British picket of 16 men and an officer from the Crown's 22nd Regiment. They were the advance troops, guarding Elizabeth Avenue, leading to the waterfront. This picket was most likely in front of where the road splits with the North Road leading to the battlements. This road would on the Halstead Point side of the river. Only the General R was documented. However, this would have been the most effective placement. The junction where downtown starts is also the most logical spot where General Hand's forces would have split to form the lines of Hand's frontal assault. This formation from a high point would appear more as a hybrid frontal assault pincer deployment. As you see the regulars approach in a frontal assault, while each flank consisted of militia with numbers comparable to each battalion. These units fanned out in the periphery, working in tandem in a pincer maneuver. In practice, this maneuver worked to spread the defenders along the earthworks. However, if it had been an equal or superior force remaining after Kyffhausen's retreat, then these units could close in and near encircle a large chunk of the British Expeditionary Force. Though unlike today, downtown didn't start at this redcoat sentry point. At that time, this picket was a block and a half past. There ended the sprawl of Elizabethtown proper. Today, this is where Elizabeth Avenue as a market ends. Behind the British vanguard of 16 steel, bald men, a large, uneven field of marshy lowlands lay between the town and the port, with two prominent rises the further. To town larger and higher lay the bulk of the British artillery. The lowland between these features was a watershed for the Elizabeth River, and it stretched for just over a mile. If the army didn't split at this precise point, the flanks would have been exposed the entire time while reaching position. We know for certain men from Seeley's the left flank, just beyond the left center Continentals, guarded the 16 prisoners of the 22nd. They were still close, with the main contingent using a wood for cannon cover. We also know that they came out from the trees north of the beachhead prior to an unfortunate engagement. This would not have been possible after the sprawl ends. I am confident this confirms my suspicions on the movements. The assault, one hand washes the other. As Continentals moved forward, the British unleashed their cannons. General Hand, still several hundred yards away from the main British lines, was surprised by the large colonnade of British artillery. It was far more cannon than a force of a mere 500 could support. Exposed and displaying honorable gall, the general rode ahead of his troops. Examining closer as artillery munition land, dangerously close Gen Hand could see this was not a paltry force, but the whole of Kyffhausen's army. Washington had anticipated thanks to Hamilton, and others later reports. In his orders, General Washington supplied Hand with an alternative battle plan for just such an event. Hand sprinted back to his line. He quickly sent messengers to the militia on both flanks to cease the advance. The British heavily pounded the center and right of the Americans with cannon fire. The forest protected the left flank from most of this hellfire, but the redcoats had small arm range. The edge of the woods was around 200 yards closer than the rivers. The right flank was provided cover by a small line of trees and slope of the bank, right before where the mouth empties into the Arthur Kill. So, the Morris militia's rage led to the first medium-ranged combat of the day. Kyffhausen sent out skirmishers from the 22nd, and several men were killed or wounded in the firefight. Thinking it was a full-on assault, the militiamen on the left returned fire in orderly. In the confusion, some of their own officers were hit by friendly fire. Colonel Seeley, with disregard of the musket and cannon fire, rode in front of his lines. He regained control, ordering the men not to shoot until he gave the order. General Hand at this time was parading his 850 Continentals in front of the British, in a feint, daring them to come out and fight. This convinced Kyffhausen that Washington's entire army was lying in wait on the streets of Elizabethtown. The Hessian commander used caution, accepting the Continental Rouge. The invaders remained inside the fortifications. Skirmishers were called back, and the expedition resigned to keeping their replies to cannon fire. With this development, Hand ordered his units to retire back to the town. All units did so in a cool and orderly manner. thus selling the planned ruse. Once American troops re-entered Elizabethtown proper, American soldiers and the militia were reformed and given new orders. The plan was to continue to show force by skirmishing and trading fire. However, nothing more was to be attempted. Brigadier General Hand ordered under no circumstance was any attempt to charge the earthworks to be made. This new mission was a sell, not a take. Washington was content to have Knyphausen pinned behind his defenses at the point. It was evident to Sterling, watching from atop the town, that Knyphausen believed that the whole northern Continental army lay just beyond an expansive field, entrenched in the streets of Elizabethtown. The British and Hessians, knowing this army, bolstered with countless New Jersey troops and militia who had already proved their aptitude for street-to-street combat the day before. Sterling, Hand, and Dayton concurred and applied the Continental commander's strategy. American troops then marched back to the fight in the same three-pronged formation, enduring the continued cannon fire. The Patriot lines reached range and began trading volleys with redcoats. All accounts deemed this part of the action remained disciplined and purposed by the rebels. The British 22nd Infantry Regiment had been the front for the whole of the day, seeing the most action. Late in the afternoon, getting the better of the 22nd in several exchanges, the Continentals and the militia on Hand's right pushed rather close to the British line. Close enough to charge, though no intent. The matter of intention was obviously unknown to the Crown's forces. So, out of necessity, 2 battalions of Hessian Jaegers had to be sent up to reinforce the 22nd. By 5 o'clock, Hand withdrew his forces back to the town, with the day's action resulting in a tactical draw and strategic victory for the young nation. Morale was in favor of the Continentals, and dispatches were sent to Washington, describing the state of hostilities. Washington had a decision to make whether to leave this better part of his army to hold Elizabethtown or to reamass on the heights. He chose the latter, but left a sizable front line behind pickets, guarding the entrance to Elizabethtown proper. He deployed small units of militia and horse with cannon across the river upon Halsted Point, facing the British left. These units could quickly alert the Elizabeth garrison, then be used to slow any British advance with fire upon the redcoat left flank, then their rear. Patrols of skirmishers were also deployed into the woods on the British right to dissuade scouting attempts by Knyphausen. This worked well, caused the newly arrived General Clinton, back from operations in the Southern Theater, march on the remaining troops at Elizabethtown on June 14th with a couple thousand to test the strength of the advance contingent of American troops. He did this in order to gain much-needed intelligence for plans to march through the Hobart Gap to reach Morristown. The British were repelled. Yet Clinton received the information for properly evaluating the American force left at Elizabeth. The British commander of the King's North American military was able to get scouts through behind the cover of his lines. This would result 9 days later in the Battle of Springfield. General Greene decided to encamp his Elizabeth garrison on the heights, leaving a sizable front line to guard Elizabethtown. This strategy worked well, giving Greene the flexibility to address any British attack with reinforcements to hold or to cover a fighting retreat. This also allowed for other options like the feigned retreat, which worked twice for the Americans during this campaign. The key component for this tactic's success was it granted the rebels the choice of battlefield. The British, despite Clinton's return, were repelled in subsequent engagements, including the Battle of Springfield on June 23rd.